this. It's always portrayed about evolution as being against religion generally, or against Christianity generally, as though their position is representing the whole view. And really that's just not at all the case. It's a very narrow view and does not represent the general view. And evolution really is not equivalent to atheism, which is what the judge said as well here. The defendants, the ID defendants in the case, and many of the leading proponents of ID make a bedrock assumption which is utterly false. Presupposition is that evolutionary theory is antithetical to belief in the existence of a supreme being and to religion in general. So he was objecting to this, saying that it's presuming something, claiming to be science, and yet making this religious objection, and one that really is false. So that's one aspect of the case, really showing that intelligent design is religion, showing that it's a particular form of religion, and then showing how it really makes the same kind of arguments that creationism made before, as really just relabeling that. Now the other part of it was the part having to do with science. Okay? It claims to be science, and yet the judge said none of the arguments that are presented by the creationists in the case were convincing. And he concludes that not one defense expert was able to explain how the supernatural action suggested by ID could be anything other than an inherently religious proposition. Okay? Accordingly, we find that ID's religious nature would have been evident to an objective observer because it directly involves supernatural designer. Okay? Now, this is part of the testimony that our side gave, saying intelligent design, like other forms of creationism, are fundamentally rejecting the basic requirement of science, which is to make appeal to things that one can test against the natural world. These are natural explanations, empirically testable, and so on. And although we made that argument, it actually turned out that we probably didn't even need to be there, because their defense experts were saying pretty much the same thing, that they were admitting that this violated the ground rules of science. So here's their three expert witnesses, Michael Behe, Scott Minnick, and Steve Fuller. And in the final case opinion, you see each of them noted by the judge as having admitted the same thing, that Behe admits that this is not designed by the laws of nature. It's impossible that designer is a natural entity, recognizing, admitting that the ID group posits a transcendent supernatural designer. Minnick saying that that this is something that violates the ground rules of science, and it has to be broadened to allow supernatural forces to be considered. Fuller saying the same thing, that the ground rules have to be rejected in this way. So their side essentially admitted this. It made it far easier than it was thought to have been before. So here's some examples of this. From the textbook of Pandas and People, so you can see exactly how this works. So here's an example. It says, this book is going to present you, the student, with two interpretations, right? Those who hold the two alternative concepts, those with a Darwinian frame of reference, as well as those who adhere to intelligent design. Now this is being set up in really exactly the same way that was set up previously under the creation science model, right? The one that was ruled unconstitutional by the courts before. There the terminology was creation science versus evolution science, but the strategy was the same. It was put up as though there are only two alternatives, and then what they do is go about trying to poke holes in evolution and make you doubt it, where the thought was, well, if you doubt that, this is the one that's left over, without then having to give any positive evidence for their own view. And in that earlier case, the judge said this is a faulty, flawed argument. It's a false dichotomy. It does not represent a valid argument. And what we saw here was really the same argument in Pandas, given in exactly the same way, but with just different terminology. So here's an example from Pandas of how these explanations supposedly work. A quote from Pandas: "Is there any alternative explanation for the marsupial bones and pouches, other than that they're homologous, and therefore evidence of common ancestry?" That's the scientific view. Yes, it says, there's another theory, and that's that marsupials were all designed with these reproductive structures. Now, you might expect that they would then go on to explain that. Okay? But that's it. That's the explanation. They were designed like that. And again and again and again, throughout the book, the pattern is exactly the same. Here's something that the scientists say, oh, but that's doubtful. But there is another explanation. The explanation is it was designed like that. And that's the end of it. Okay? That's the extent of those explanations. Now, in all of my reading of the intelligent design literature, I've only found one place where they're more specific than that. And it had to do with Philip Johnson explaining the peacock's tail. So this is the one case where they get a little more specific. So let's take a look at Johnson so we can see how the theory really works. The peacock, says Johnson, this is a quote, is something that an uncaring evolutionary process would never allow to develop, but which is, quote, just the kind of creature that a whimsical creator might favor. Okay. So here you see the difference, right? You've got the scientific explanation, the evidence on that, one hand, and on the other hand you have divine whimsy. Okay. Okay. So I hope you can see the difference between the scientific explanation and this other. It's really quite different. It violates this basic presumption that in science you have to appeal to testable, natural explanations. Here's an example. In philosophy, it's called methodological naturalism. It's a fancy term, but Sidney Harris from American Scientists had this cartoon that nicely summarizes it. You've got this one guy who's been working at the board very hard with these elaborate equations, but obviously he's got a gap in there, and then he writes, then a miracle occurs. And his colleague says, you know, I think you should be a little more explicit here in step 2. That, in essence, is the basis of the ground rules of science. You can't appeal to a miracle to explain something that's a gap, right? You've got to be able to give an explanation in terms of natural processes, ones that are testable. Really, this is the defining characteristic of science from the point in which science became science. We use the term now science, but originally science was called natural philosophy. Okay, that's actually the original term. And what we meant by natural philosophy was just this kind of approach. And what was natural philosophy reacting against? It was reacting against a previous view that did allow explanations in terms of transcendent supernatural forces. It was called the occult philosophy. And really science was a reaction against, natural philosophy was a reaction against the occult philosophy and occultism generally. So really what's going on here is that intelligent design and other creationists are wanting to bring back this old view, this pre-scientific view. And it came across very clearly in the trial when Michael Behe, under cross-examination, admitted that under his definition of science, this broad definition, that astrology would be included as well, things that appeal to the supernatural in that way. And this is the thing I think that's important to keep in mind. This is really undermining a basic assumption here. One of the things that I thought was kind of amusing, I found a picture of Behe sitting in his office. Here he is, his book's in the background. But if you look carefully at the T-shirt that he's wearing, you can tell there he's actually got a wizard who looks just like the astrologer up above. I think it's probably Gandalf or something. But I think it's emblematic of the nature of the intelligent design movement. I actually wrote an article at one point called The Wizards of Id. And this is the nature of their view. All right. Here's another example, probably the one that's most familiar, from Behe. This came up again and again in the trial, the claim that irreducible complexity is something that evolution can't explain. Probably the most common argument that you hear from the intelligent design group. And what irreducible complexity means, according to Behe, is a functional system such that if you remove any of the parts, it doesn't function. His example is a mousetrap. You've got to have all these parts. You take away the spring, you take away the hammer, you take away these things, and it's going to catch no mice, and so on. And his claim is that science can't explain this, that evolution can't produce these things. Here's his argument. He says any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that's missing a part is by definition non-functional.